Dark Crystal.
Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another Hype Mini Reviews, where hype comes to die. I'm Skurita, and today we're going to tackle the Dark Crystal. This was a request from one of my viewers in the Neverending Story video. After all, I did say that Neverending Story had as good animatronics as Hanson's, but is that true? Let's find out. This is just a movie, no comics and no series. So, what is it about? The Dark Crystal is a 1982 dark fantasy movie, and right out of the gate we can see that there are nothing but heavy hitters, since it's produced by none other than Jim Henson, directed by Frank Oz, and with designs from Brian Froud, who also worked on Labyrinth. It's considered to this day Henson's magnum opus, and while initially received with mixed reviews, it nonetheless manages to become one of the highest grossing puppet movies in the USA. In the planet of Tra, there was a gigantic and powerful crystal that cracked on the day of the great conjunction of the planet's three suns. From this rupture, two new races appeared, the malevolent Skeksis and the peaceful but passive Mystics. The Skeksis soon conquered most of the land, and ruled for hundreds of years after exterminating the Gelflings, a species prophesied to make the crystal whole again, and thus reunite Skeksis and Mystics. Except that now, a new conjuncture approaches and the Gelflings may not be that exterminated after all. Writing. This time I'll have to do my review in a different order because of how this whole movie is structured. First and foremost, this isn't a children's movie. It may give this impression because of the puppets and Henson's fame, but this is a dark fantasy with emphasis on dark. You see people and creatures bleeding, being brutally tortured and killed in several ways. The body count isn't high, but it's explicit, which bizarrely makes it a normal 80s movie because it just reaches Don Bluth's level and style. Anyway, moving on. We are greeted with an exposition dump.
Another world, another time, in the age of wonder.
But actually well done. It's a slow, methodical narration that uses poetic language to explain the alien planet and its weird story. It's brief, it's paused, it follows what happens on screen akin to a documentary, so it doesn't feel as if it's just loose padding. The tone is somber, with a grave voice to tell you that no, this isn't a whimsical adventure where colorful creatures frolic through the meadows.
Now the Skeksis gather in the sacred chamber, where the crystal hangs above a shaft of air and fire.
We are introduced to the Skeksis, the Mystics. There is the obvious juxtaposition of two sides of the same coin before the plot is kicked, with the leader of the Mystics delivering the last piece of exposition before dying.
I should have told you these things long ago.
Yeah, why didn't you tell me sooner? See, here's the thing. Dark Crystal is one of those works where you have to separate the elements of the writing in order to appreciate it fully. On its own, it's a simple tried and true hero's journey with all its basic elements, plot beats, and problems. Jen is introduced, he is more of the blank slate meant to repeat what people tell him, doesn't have much of a personality to make the viewer step into his shoes, and off he goes.
I'm not ready to go alone. All right? Alone then.
Huh, that was fast. On his way, he finds other last of the Gelflings, Kira. They bond, more exposition through the interactions, Kira has her own annoying pet pest that barely helps the plot, and they go on their quest to make the crystal whole again and save the world. It's simple, straightforward, and remember, simple is good. Yeah, having our protagonist with more of a personality and agency would be good, but said simplicity is a trade-off to make it easier for the viewer to take in the true star of the movie, the world itself. What differentiates Dark Crystal from other dark fantasy movies of its era is how the world itself is fleshed out, without having a pantheon. In movies like Conan the Barbarian, you have the focus on the supernatural, with gods and monsters. Here, while there are some esoteric elements, most of the plot is kicked by the alien instead of the divine. It's Olgra, an astrologist and not an oracle, who talks about the conjunction to Jen. The Skeksis use cruel science to make their minions and to prolong their lives. But there are no thunderclouds made of dark rituals. They are linked to the mystics through the crystal, yeah, but honestly this felt like something from more of a Star Trek episode than the usual fare of fantasy. This is just beyond our capable of reasoning, not beyond what's physically possible, at least in that world. Again, I'm not saying that there isn't any mystical elements in this movie, but the focus isn't there. Both Gelflings can transfer their memories at touch, but on the other hand, there is a surprising ground of sexual dimorphism between both Gelflings which I won't spoil. Help is found through skills and languages, not just because. And while their characterization isn't overly deep, the movie does trace an interesting parallel between a gal who was raised by a tribe that lives in harmony with nature, but in the middle of the forest, and a guy who also is raised by a tribe that lives in harmony with nature, but are more scholastic. Jen can read, is more inventive and knowledgeable, while Kira is handy and is more apt at surviving. It's enough to give our protagonists a good flavor, but could have been done more, especially in comparison with the Skeksis. They ooze personality and are well placed against each other, the obvious clash being the Chamberlain and the General, machinations running high, but not being against the movie, much on the contrary, giving it more personality and helping the plot along. Each one has their time and place to shine, and while it can be argued that the intro where they deal with the succession crisis can feel a bit long, it's nonetheless important to flesh out the scenario itself. Overall, the plot is indeed simpler and even shallow at times in comparison with the world building. Neverending Story manages to give a more involved and deeper themes while keeping a simple travel plot, but let's be honest, you're not here for the plot. The plot is nice, but it's downright an excuse for the world building and most of all the visuals. Yeah. There is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the visuals are the highlight of this movie. It reached downright impressive moments, especially when you consider the technology of the time. But there are some bumps here and there. But one step at a time. Let's go through the salad before going for the meat. The camera itself follows the standard fare of the time, but also done in a really good way. Since this is A dark fantasy movie, and B, a puppet movie, the camera is often distant and slower, and this is a team with an insane amount of experience with puppetry. Expect long exposition shots, panoramic shots, and wide angles to both show the bizarre alien geography, the exotic puppetry, but at the same time hide the details like the puppeteer's strengths as such. Unless it's time to invert it and give focus on the expressions of the animatronics, their nuances, and hide everything else. And of course to downright flaunt the beautiful scenarios. If you spent a lot of money on a set, you'd make it sure that every single detail was shown as much as you can, and it's obvious that the photography is also downright gorgeous sometimes. Scenes are also longer with a slower pace, giving the impression that this movie is twice as long as it really is, but due to the straightforward writing, it doesn't reach boring levels. Much on the contrary, several scenes go for long enough to let the horror, or the wonder, breathe accordingly. This movie uses the lost art of the one-shot, as in the camera following either the main character or the characters to open up and focus on something wondrous or horrifying. Be it the observatory, the vile chamberlain with his clothes torn, or something more simple yet poignant, like the gelflings holding hands. Expect a few traveling montages, but nothing on the level of Neverending Story. And, as expected, everything is done so the viewer can slowly absorb the immense exotic world of Tra. Color palette is also a standard fare for the 80s of dark fantasy, so expect darker tones. Shade palette is used very well here, knowing when to give a monochromatic tone or bombard the screen with the colors. Sometimes the camera will linger in a monochromatic environment only to suddenly shift to something really colorful and vice versa. For example, all the brown of the mystics living in their stale unchanging ways in contrast with the grey castle of the Skeksis with silk draped and lavish beds. Even when the environment is all brown, like a party or a village, it doesn't last long enough to be an eyesore. The sets themselves range from normal to absurdly detailed. You see feasts with cutlery tossed around the floor, water wheel systems in the background, an observatory absurdly chock full of alien tools, ruins taken by the forest, and more. Henson spared no expenses in making everything in this movie, including and especially the backgrounds, into a visual feast for better immersion. And of course, it works. Such is the attention to detail that he even bothered to make a stone incandescent after being sliced from a monolith. Acting. Speaking of, let's dig into the meat of the meal, the puppetry and the animatronics. This is the biggest visual flex I've seen in a movie in years, and if you consider the technologies available and the craft behind it, it's an even bigger flex than Avatar. Henson didn't have to go this far with the many creatures in both complexity, design and role, but that's the point. He did it because he could and he wanted to do it. For example, no puppet movie would bother making several background creatures, each one with its particular quirks, and give them screen time. But he did it anyway. This is an alien world, but a living and breathing one with a story of its own told by the visuals. There are critters that only roll around, large slug-like pool dwellers, creepy mechanical bats made of wood and stone, and the main animatronics are a work of art. I honestly struggle to find a point from which to begin, because sweet Jesus Christ on a flaming tricycle, just look at this level of details. It's not just the creatures, but everything around them. The mystics alone show how elaborate things could get with skins marked by what seems to be tattoos. 4 arms, every one of them having a different cloak with a different pattern and color. Their village is also made with aliens in mind. Since they are large and slow, they have no stairs, their beds have a different shape, their fingers move swiftly even though they are big and lumbering. And this all in contrast with the stars of the show, the Skeksis. They are also lumbering beasts, but their designs are as elaborate as they are purposefully disgusting. And each Skeksis is absurdly different from the other, while they share the same vulture-like design. Thick, elaborate skin mixed with jewels, makeup, prosthetics and more. Shades of purple like an oil pool with a gilded set of clothes with several kinds of beads and jewels. Even their cutlery is done in an alien way and gilded, with finger forks sporting big jewels to show the opulence mixed with the corruption. And this is where I have an interesting hypothesis that would only be able to be proved if I were big enough to interview the designer, but I think that the Skeksis design uses the Uncanny Valley on purpose. A weaponized Uncanny Valley, if you will. That because of their eyes. Everything about them is alien, except the eyeballs. None of the Skeksis use or have anything white, except for the human-like eyeballs in their skulls in a way that draws the attention of the viewer. If they had half-lidded eyes like the Mystics or button eyes like the Podlings, it wouldn't have such an effect. But no, there's something human in that creature, something revolting, and by far they are the most elaborate of the puppets. You see eyelids up and wide, lips curl, wings open, fingers being pointed, hands bleeding, yes, wiggling their heads like serpents as they walk. And then on the other side you have Jen and Kira. This is where things start to get shaky. When I watched this movie again for a review, as soon as Jen appeared naked wiggling his legs on the pond, I remember why I didn't finish this movie before. Because Jen hits my Uncanny Valley harder than Coop hits a missile button. In a world of wondrous creatures, he's just a normal puppet with a mouth pulled out as if he was made of clay, a scruffy hairdo as if he tried to be a glam rocker and ended a yuppie, or that stereotypical redneck with a pseudo mullet. His long fingers and dead eyes. Don't help either. His design and motions are absurdly simplistic by comparison to the other puppets. As long as neither he or Kira were in focus, I could handle the movie well due to the absurdly detailed backgrounds. But when he gets a face zoom... yeah, I wouldn't blame anyone if he got so revolted by the Uncanny Valley that they quit. Because if the other creatures, even the Skeksis, were so far away from being human that your brain naturally puts them as something else, the Gelflings are the opposite. They are too close to being just normal humans with just 2 or 3 weird traits. So if the Skeksis Uncanny Valley was weaponized, the Gelflings were a backfire. Other characters such as Ogra and the Podlings end up in the middle of the road. Ogra is purposefully ugly and humanoid, but in a way that you can chalk up to bizarre fantasy folk, especially with her eye being removable. And the Podlings are the standard fare of the Hansen's puppeteer show from the Muppets. The Garfin are a point of small contention. They were meant to be insectoid crawlings like such, but the awkward motion of the puppeteers inside is rather obvious. But it didn't bother me much, so I'd say that the whole tree will depend on personal taste. Lastly, while the main brunt of the movie aged like wine due to the puppetry, the chroma key at the end wasn't bad, but even by standards of the time, couldn't be exactly considered good, which only makes things worse as it aged. Soundtrack. Yep, no hesitation here whatsoever. The soundtrack draws from the high and dark fantasy genres, and I have to admit that I was surprised to see that it wasn't made by John Williams, but by Trevor Jones, who also worked on high fantasy movies such as Excalibur and High Time Bandits. It's really good and ties well with the cinematography, rising and lowering as the action demands. His orchestrated score hits very well with the one-shots of Jen discovering the observatory, or when the Skeksis send their Garfing after the Gelflings. And I was saddened to hear that his score didn't gather much attention. On the voice acting, honestly, there isn't much to say. The Chamberlain's iconic speaks, or rather mumbles, for itself. This is a crew of really experienced voice actors, and it shows with the intensity of their voices matching very well the creatures wobbling about. Fun fact, this movie almost went with no English for the Skeksis. Hansen at first wanted them to speak an alien language, and the actions to speak for themselves, which honestly the cinematography and puppeteering does well, but I understand why they didn't go ahead with it. Final thoughts. This is one of those movies that is indeed worth of its hype. Even if its story is simple and could be fleshed out further, it's obvious why people claim this to be Jim Henson's magnum opus. The camera and colors are more than solid enough to earn a recommendation, but the titanic work on the visuals, the puppets, the designs, the backgrounds elevate it to a must-see. This is one of those artifacts of a lost era, of slow cameras, of dark fantasy that wasn't afraid of dipping into downright horror, but it would be unfair to say that it's not with its problems. The main design of the gelflings and the lack of depth end up being a crack in what's otherwise a beautiful crystal of the past. So yeah, check this out if you can. And no, I'm sadly not interested in checking the Netflix series. I'm not much into prequels, and even less prequels prematurely cancelled because someone needed another Baby Boss movie. Well, this is all for today. See you all next time.